All right, we're going to get started. Thank you all for joining us tonight for the Winter Shapiro Lecture. We couldn't be more excited to learn tonight from Rabbi Dr. Ariel and Mayse. I first just wanted to mention what the Shapiro Lectures are, and they are an annual lecture series hosted by the Catholic Jewish Studies program here at Catholic Theological Union, and they're generously funded by the Shapiro Foundation. The lectures are a chance for the CTU community to hear from the very best scholars in Jewish studies, whose work touches on topics of import to interreligious studies, dialogue, and theology. Tonight, we will get a chance to learn about rewilding the tree of life, Jewish law and theology in a time of climate change. Not only is this a topic of vital importance to our shared world, but it's also appropriate for today's Jewish holiday of Tu B'Shvat, the Jewish New Year for the trees, of which a group of us here at CTU have just been celebrating together. And Tu B'Shvat is sort of known throughout the world as the Jewish Earth Day, so this is very appropriate learning. I also want to ask that all of you leave your questions for the end, and once we finish the lecture, please either write your question in the chat or raise your hand and I will call on you. I also realized I neglected to introduce myself. My name is Renana Dine, and I am the Crown Ryan Chair and Assistant Professor of Catholic Jewish Studies here at Catholic Theological Union, as well as the Director of the Catholic Jewish Studies Program. I would now like to introduce our speaker. Ariel Evan Mayse is an Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Stanford University, the Rabbi in Residence at Atik, a Jewish Maker Institute, and Senior Scholar in Residence at the Institute of Jewish Spirituality and Society. Previously, he served as the Director of Jewish Studies and a Visiting Assistant Professor of Modern Jewish Thought at Hebrew College in Newton, Massachusetts, and a Research Fellow at the Frankel Institute for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. Mayse holds a Ph.D. in Jewish Studies from Harvard University and Rabbinic Ordination from Beit Midrash Ariel in Israel. He's the author of Laws of the Spirit, Ritual, Mysticism, and the Commandments in Early Hasidism, 2024, and Speaking Infinities, God and Language in the Teachings of Rabbi Dov Ber of Mezrich, 2020. And his current book project is As a Deep River Rises, Judaism, Ecology, and Environmental Ethics. And that is under contract with Brandeis University Press, so we look forward to seeing it soon. And without further ado, Dr. Rabbi Mayse.
Thank you so much for this kind invitation and for that really generous introduction. Can you remind me of the arc of the evening? How much time shall I speak? And then...
Yeah, so about 45 minutes.
Perfect.
You stretch to an hour, and then we'll have hopefully 45, 30 minutes for questions if we last that long.
Okay. Sounds great. Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here, even if virtually. I'm jealous of all the people that got to be there in person, but it's wonderful to see some dear friends and also many new friends this evening, and I'm grateful for this invitation. It is particularly auspicious to be here in the dwindling moments of the holiday of Tu B'Shvat, which is, in many respects, a kind of minor holiday on the Jewish calendar, but it's one that plays an outsized role in the Jewish imagination. It's called Rosh Hashanah La'ilan, the New Year for the tree, which really in the ancient rabbinic context was about when you take fruit for tithing. Does it count for this year? Does it count for next year? And it's about when the moment at which the tree has reached its fruition, quite literally, where does that fall out in terms of the calendrical year? But within the Jewish imagination, this holiday has taken on a different set of significances. It comes to embody the rebirth after the winter. It also has become a symbol for how we think about Torah. Rosh Hashanah Le'ilan, the Kabbalists remind us, is curiously in the singular, just one tree. And they describe this as Rosh means head in Hebrew. So Rosh Hashanah Le'ilan is the time to rethink to put a new mindset on when we approach the tree, which of course is the tree of life. And when we think about the tree, it's often the case that in Jewish sources, we refer to the work of interpretation as endless. We turn it over and turn it over, as an ancient rabbinic source has it, for everything is within it. Now, this feels more like talking about compost than a tree. You turn it over and new things sprout, but you can't just turn it over once. You have to turn it over and turn it over and turn it over. I want to share with you a different version of that teaching, which you now have in front of you, which feels almost the same, but it's one of the oldest manuscript traditions that we have. Turn it over and turn it over, for all of it is within you, and all of you is within it. Just a couple of letters, but it's actually quite different. Rather than treating tradition as an object to be turned over, here the story of our lives and the story of Torah are totally intertwined one with the other. Whenever I think about this source, I think about the moment in the book, The Never-Ending Story, where the protagonist who's reading this novel realizes he's reading a book about his own story, and his decisions in his life impact the way that that story unfolds. But reading the book also transforms his own life in that it stretches the horizons of that which feels possible. Books are meant to be lived in, and they are meant to be lived with. And it's this vision of Torah, this vision of tradition, this vision of the wisdom of the ancients that I bring with us into this dialogue. Tradition is not something that sits on a shelf. Tradition is something that is constantly remade in the present. Now, what kind of tree is this tree of life? We're often taught it's an apple tree. Ancient traditions suggest that it might actually have been an etrog tree, a kind of lemon or citron tree. Why? Because it's the most fragrant of all trees. One ancient midrash says the tree of life, the tree of Torah, is a fig tree. Any gardeners in the room? Fig trees are the bane of our lives because they send out those rhizomatic roots that take over the entire garden. But they're also extraordinary specimens in that when you approach a fig tree, no matter where you look, there's always something new. Over the time of their ripening cycle, which is extraordinarily long, it's not like an apple where they go from unripe to ripe and then it's the peak season. They stretch out over time. And the more time you spend with that tree, the more you'll find something. I have three young children, ages 13, 10, and 9, and we have a giant fig tree that sort of dominates our backyard. And whenever we send them out into the backyard to go collect figs, they each find a different set of figs because they're different heights and they're different people. And there's the one who will crawl underneath and find them at the very bottom. And there's the one who will reach to the top. And this, say the rabbis of the Talmud, is the vision of Torah. There's no one meaning. And in fact, the more time you spend with it, the more time it spends with you. And the more you think with it, the more is possible. So I'd like you to hold on to this as we continue across the next 40 minutes or so, and we think about what the traditions of Judaism and their entanglements within the Catholic tradition might have to say to us in our contemporary moment. What follows is a constructive exploration of a set of interlocking issues that really keep me up at night as I consider the future of this planet and also the planet that I'm bequeathing to my own children, which will be less biologically rich, less culturally rich than the one that I inherited. We are, and I'm sure this comes as no surprise to anyone here, in the midst of a grave crisis. Carbon emissions continue to rise, pollution of all different stripes, of air, land, and water, catastrophic loss of biodiversity, resource depletion, extreme weather events, ecosystems on the verge of collapse, and we, as a part of those ecosystems, teeter at a brink. Models, however, are not inspiring significant change. No amount of climactic data seems to be transforming the way we look at the world. If the science is in, the jury is still out. How are we going to respond? How will we move toward a more sustainable planetary existence? What kind of world will we leave to the next generation? There's an old Yiddish joke that says, let's move on to something happier after that conversation, like the cholera in Odessa. This is very difficult. I hope it doesn't cause us to lose hope. Why is religion a part of this discussion? Sometimes it's suggested that religious sources ought to be bare on climate issues because they're really good at getting people to work together. I don't always see that in real life. Some people have suggested that religious sources are good at getting people motivated. That's true, sometimes. It's also suggested that religions are transnational, and therefore they don't fall prey to the limitations of the structures of governments and organizational bodies that seem like they are paralyzed and unable to move forward. I'm going to put forward a very different set of theses about why religion is so important for addressing climate change over the course of this evening. Now, despite the fact that climate change is described by scientists and sociologists as a wicked problem, a problem multifactorial, so difficult to get your mind around that there's no one clear solution, the study of sustainability is quite siloed. There are often said to be three pillars, all of which have their own robust disciplines and discourses and fields and norms. So that's the environment, the social, and the environmental, social, and economic dimensions of sustainability. They interact in different ways with one another. Sometimes one is given pride of place. Sometimes they are jostling, competing with one another. These different models for thinking about the way in which they connect all have their strengths, and they all have their shortcomings. I'd invite us to consider, as we think about economic, social, and environmental dimensions of how we think about climate change, to think about what's missing. What's missing from these discussions? Could it be that while each of these have something to say, we've actually missed the heart of the matter? These are translated directly into the way that the UN's Sustainable Development Goals have been formulated. And again, if you look at this, it's very hard to find fault with any of these, per se. But what's missing? What kinds of cultural, spiritual dimensions are lacking if we rush for solutions that are grounded only in certain ways of thinking? Now, I want to pause for a moment and to move back a little bit in time. So that was from 2015, and we're going to step back into the 1960s as we think with a famous, perhaps infamous essay by the scholar Lynn White, Jr., who taught at Stanford for no small part of his career, who famously indicted religion and by that he meant the Judeo-Christian tradition, as being one of the primary causes of the ecological crisis. He says this already in the 1960s. So what's the problem? The argument goes as follows. Contemporary science in the 1960s is built upon earlier forms of knowledge, largely religious ones, and therefore all of the shortcomings of religion, a linear conception of time, a teleology in which you move from creation to revelation and then eventually toward redemption, which is a kind of inevitable march that leaves this worldly concern in behind. A vision of God as transcendent and uncaring, and a generalized indifference to nature. These are the accusations that he levels against religion and especially Judeo-Christian tradition, which of course, whenever you hear that phrase, already what's coming next is going to be wrong because there's no such thing as a Judeo-Christian tradition. There are so many strands within them that are interwoven. We got to be more specific. But one of the things that he does note, and these are two very important points, is that if the problems have technological solutions and scientific solutions, they're only going to be partial. For an interesting case study, you might compare this with the recently published Techno-Optimist Manifesto, which reads, I quote, "We believe that there is no material problem, whether created by nature or by technology, that cannot be solved with more technology." End quote. Really? I find that to be such a strange formulation. But I teach at Stanford, a school that has a healthy respect for technology. And yet I will say that there is a growing, brooding awareness among so many different fields of the study of sustainability that something tremendous is lacking. He also notes that if religion contributed to the problem, religion must be a part of the solution. Now, this essay set religious thinkers and leaders and scholars of religion really back on their heels, and everyone tried to figure out what to do. One response was denial. There's such thing as a climate crisis. It's going to be okay. That's something that you found already in the 1960s, and that continues to be one dominant field of discourse. Another is an acceptance that disaster will lead to something better. We might have to chop down all the trees, and then God will redeem us. Another response is what I sometimes call retrievalism. Everything is there. We just have to look into the background. We have to look back into tradition and we'll have all the answers that we need. Okay, we'll see that there are some issues with that. And in doing so, many traditions ended up eliding the distinctions between them and eliding their own unique voices. If you read the Assisi Accords from the 1980s, the Assisi Declarations, pretty much all the religious traditions who have someone representing them say more or less the same thing. Here, I think there's an enormous pitfall of falling into an assumption that they all say the same thing, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. There's also been no small amount of greenwashing of religious traditions, and one of the things that I find particularly problematic is the search for analogs. I know that I need to be a good steward, so I'm going to find a way to say that in Jewish, for example. If we do only that, we have fallen prey to the mindsets of modernity that have led us to these problems. What if, and here I begin the more constructive dimension of my talk, what if religion has something else to offer? Precisely because it does not fall prey to those mindsets, and because it does not accord itself with the values and the vocabularies of contemporary capitalist thinking, religious traditions offer something different. Sometimes I call this feral thinking or rewilding, the rewilding of the mind. Here you have a picture of my favorite animal. Could talk about grizzly bears until the cows come home, but it's not our subject for tonight. What does this mean? So rewilding is a conservation theory that relies on three C's. These are the pillars. One is strong cores in which plants and animals can coexist. A second is that those cores, those areas, need to be connected to one another. So they can't have isolated populations here, isolated populations there. They need to have a strong level of connectivity. And the third, and this is very important, is that coexistence, humans and non-human animals, humans and animals, humans and the landscape, need to be able to coexist with one another because human nature binaries are part of the problem that have led us into this issue. So I've suggested three different C's for rewilding theology. The first is creativity. The second is curriculum. And the third is collaboration and conversation. Creativity in the way that we read the sources of the past. Curriculum that must be broadened. And collaboration and conversation within traditions and without. And rather than thinking about education or theological dialogue as a set of silos, each in their own little universe, I think about it as an ecotone, that marshy place that different biological spheres connect to one another, which is always a hotspot of life and always a hotspot of new things. Now, one of my teachers in this thinking, at least in the domain of text, has been Pope Francis, whose 2015 encyclical Laudato Si is a brilliant, to my mind, investigation of the spiritual underpinnings and the ethical failures that have led us to this point. One of the things that makes this such a remarkable and in many ways radical text is that Pope Francis is entirely aware of and entirely committed to addressing the social dimensions, issues of equity and justice that come along with climate change, acknowledging that it's disproportionate in its impact and also disproportionate in its causes. And so in this letter, which is a searing indictment of the social hierarchies that have led us to this point, Pope Francis also notes that an over-reliance on technological solutions isn't just an operational failure, it's actually a failure of the mind in which science is given an exclusive voice to determine what can be done and what ought to be done. Pope Francis pays attention to the interweaving of the biological diversity and human diversity, noting that the extinction of plants and animals leads to the extinction of human cultures as well. He places huge significance on a sense of place, on local foodways, and on the empowerment of communities and peoples. And in doing so, he traces an indictment of the certain ills that are wrought not only by the legacies of colonialism, but by capitalism itself. Amongst the many, many different things that I've taken from this text and continue as I walk with it in the world is the broad and capacious lens with which he grappled with these questions, acknowledging that because climate change and all of its attendant issues are so complicated and so multifactorial, there's no one religious tradition, there's no one discipline, there's no one people, there's no one book, there's no one leader, there's no one religion that can answer all of these questions. The only way forward is working together. Now, this document has been translated, not in a literal sense, but translated into a set of goals that are sometimes called the action plan or the Laudato Si action goals, which I think bear very interesting comparison to the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. And I think together, thinking about as a kind of ecotone, they provide us with a way of moving forward into the future. So, with all this being said, I feel a little bit like Groucho Marx. Before I begin to speak, I've got something important to say. With all this being said, I'd like you to hold on to this image of of theological conversation as an ecotone. I'd like you to hold on to this image of tradition as something that we turn over, but it also turns us over, and that we work on it and it works on us in the same way that the books that we read make moral, spiritual, and ethical claims of us. And I'd like to think together across our next minutes about some of the sources from the legal and poetic and theological traditions of Judaism that have something to share with us in our time. We've seen these? Okay. So this is a basic roadmap of where we're going. Don't worry, all of these things will make sense as we continue. But I want to start actually not with the beautiful descriptions of creation, of the beautiful world in the book of Genesis, which are often where Jewish environmental thinking, if not also religious environmental thinking in the tradition, in the Christian tradition as well, begin. But I want to start with the book of Jeremiah, and I'd like to start with the book of Lamentations. Why? Because one of the things that religion can offer us, one of the things that Judaism can offer us, is an acknowledgement that things can end. Worlds change. One of the earliest midrashim, one of the earliest rabbinic traditions that we have, describes God as creating worlds and destroying them. And the rubble of the previous world is used to make the next one. Philosophers have this fancy term called epistemic opacity, which they use to describe the way that human beings can be told there's a wall right in front of you, but until you run into it, you don't really believe them. How else can we explain the fact that, by and large, except for the most ardent climate deniers, something between 80 to 80% of Americans believe that the climate is changing? That's a number that's actually been relatively stable since the 1970s. It's gone up, it's gone down, but it's been in the mid 80s. 85%, let's take that number, believe that the climate is changing, and yet large-scale change isn't taking part. Why might that be? One answer is that the human mind, and especially the mind that modernity has given us, in which we believe in a kind of linear development of time and a myth of infinite progress, which, rather than pinning that on religion, I pin that on modernity. It's impossible for us to conceive that worlds can end. And yet, if you talk to indigenous philosophers, if you talk to Black theologians, not only can worlds end, worlds have ended. And so looking to technology, our eyes pining away for deliverance, means that we're refusing to do the hard work of looking inwards when things fall apart. The question is, what do you do in those difficult times? I was once asked by a prominent scholar of Jewish studies, does Judaism say anything about climate engineering? And I thought, and I didn't come up with anything. And then I discovered this text, which you have on the screen in front of you. And I'm not going to read these texts by and large. I'm happy to send out the slide deck if anyone would like to see them. But you have them here while I'm speaking, so that not only can you check my work, but you can see them for yourselves. The text at the very top from Bereshit Rabbah, 5th or 6th century of the Common Era, describes the generation of the flood who sees the heavens begin to drip. And what do they say? No problem. We got this. Let's build a bunch of pillars to hold it up, and we'll stave off the flood. Turns out there are actually cognate midrashim in the Talmud. There are a bunch of others that say pretty much the same thing. There's one that says, oh, if it's going to be a flood of fire, no problem. We've got this technology. If it's going to be heavenly water, we can hold it up with this. And if it's water from the earth, we got that too. And this particular version, which is my favorite, or at least draws my heart in ways that the others don't, connects those pillars that are holding up the heavens and preventing things from crashing down. 3 of those we don't know anything about, but evidently the 4th is the Tower of Babel. And so what you hear here in this case is the rabbinic imagination connecting the story of the flood with the story of one of the great moments of human hubris in the Hebrew Bible, and saying, what does it mean to be like God? It means to pretend that you can control the environment in this kind of almost magical way. But it's really a kind of feat of engineering. And beneath that, you have a source about what's one of the oldest ones, actually, about the golem, one of the most famous Jewish legends. Before he was the defender of Prague, this is one of the first. And here you have a description of creating the golem by writing out one of the names of God on its forehead. And then the rabbi who created it saw that it was getting bigger and bigger, and it was growing in such a way that it was going to destroy the world. So he erases God's name from it, and the golem collapses. But the golem injures him in the process, wounding his forehead exactly in the same place that the name of God had been written on the golem's head. And I take this to be a kind of reflection on the reflexive hazards of the things that we create. Technology creates us as much as we create it. It rewires our brain. It transforms the way our cities are built. But perhaps more than anything, it also gives us an illusion of control that we do not have. And in that sense, it prevents us from doing some of the most important spiritual work. Here you have a passage from Maimonides in the 12th and 13th centuries, who says, what happens when there's no rain? What happens when things begin to fall apart? Well, says Maimonides, basing this on an ancient rabbinic tradition found in the Mishnah, we fast. But not only do we fast as individuals, the entire community comes together. They put ash on each other's forehead. They bring the Torah out of the synagogue and put it in the center of the city. And they put it on the ground of the city square. And they mourn publicly. But this is where Maimonides, and then, according to the Mishnah, then they begin to sing. Because it is with song that we transform. But this is where Maimonides, the ethicist, comes to the foreground. And he says, if you declare, this is just the way things are. It's the way of the world, tragedies happen. He says this is a path of cruelty. He uses a very strong word, derech achzariyut. And then he says, not only is it callous towards other people, it causes them to persevere in their own behaviors that have brought them to this point. Now, Maimonides was a very sophisticated and thoughtful human being. I do not think he means oh, a tree fell on my car during the night, it's because I'm a sinner. I think what he is pointing out here is that the social breakdown that precedes catastrophe, and that's what happens in the book of Jeremiah. That's what happens in the book of Lamentations. And really the inability to care for and express concern for the marginalized elements of society. That's how it is in the book of Jeremiah. That's how it is in the book of Lamentations. That's what leads us into crisis. So what do, says Maimonides, when things fall apart? We work together. We do what the great environmental philosopher and biologist Donna Haraway would call staying with the trouble, or what the great poet Adrian Rich would call diving into the wreck. Because only in doing that can we examine the deepest pathways of mind and society that have brought us to this point. Here I've learned something very important from the social scientist Kyle White, who teaches at the University of Michigan, who has a wonderful article where he says, you know, when we're faced with difficult circumstances, we have two choices. When I'm talking to my students about this, I often ask if anyone here has been in a fight with someone they love. And usually people raise their hand. And then I ask, so who at the end of that was really proud of what they said? Every once in a while I get a hand up, but usually people put their hands down and they chuckle, because we all know that in those moments of crisis, we're not our best selves. Yeah, exactly, says Kyle White. This is the point. In moments of crisis, we fall back on the things that we think we know. We double down on the things that have brought us to that point. But he says it can be otherwise. And this is exactly what I found in the Mishnah. And this is exactly what you see in Maimonides. A mindset of coordination means, what are the values that then drive forward that moment of fright and fear? Reciprocity, coordination, communication, mutuality, obligation. Same changing circumstances. Things fall apart. That is inevitable. It is in the nature of life. Entropy is a part of our world. And yet, on the other hand, we are faced with an enormous choice. Enormous in the sense of its consequence. Do we seek to push other people away in those moments, or do we draw them near? A second point that I'd like to make about the possibilities of religious thought and ecology in our day. We're often taught to see the world as an object. The physical world and the landscape is an object. That leads directly to a kind of extractive mindset where we pull minerals out of the earth, where we pull things from its surface, and we take. That goes back to the 16th century, really the 17th century, in its contemporary form. And again, despite the fact that I am obviously aware that religious traditions have been complicit in many of these same violences, the famous verses from the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verses 26 and 28, in which human beings are supposedly charged with the capacity to take over the earth and to dominate it. In religious traditions, in Judaism and Christianity, to a large degree, what that always meant was living in concert, living in connection, living with a sense of ability to use the fruits of the world, but not to hoard them and not to destroy them. And there's actually a very clear shift in which that changes in the way that religious traditions interpreted that verse, and that's the Industrial Revolution. And there we see that the economic interest is really what drove that. Now, if we're taught to see the world as largely static, first of all, the idea that the world might fight back is impossible for us to understand. And so we're woefully unprepared of the fact that whether it's fires or whether it's earthquakes or whether it's floods, we might be on the receiving end of some of that immense and immeasurable power. Um, but I think there's a deeper issue, which is that by seeing the world as static, as totally disenchanted, we've robbed ourselves of a different myth. And I mean that in the most positive sense of myth as the way that ideas and values are set into narrative form. We've robbed ourselves of the myth of a world that is animate, that flexes and reveals and shimmers with divinity. You can't open a book in the Jewish mystical tradition without reading about how the landscape itself is filled with divine vitality. And I don't think that's just rhetoric. In fact, there's a famous 16th century Kabbalist who lived in the town of Tzfat who said, you know what heresy really is? Heresy is saying, not saying, heresy is not saying, oh, God has an arm or God has a leg. That's small potatoes. Heresy is saying that is a stone and not God, because you're destroying an element of divinity. So, says Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, this Kabbalist, all things radiate with divinity. And you find that in its perhaps fullest expression within the Hasidic tradition. The great mystics of Hasidism describe the world not only as created by God, but as filled with God. Here you see it in the opening sentence of the text from Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev. The blessed Creator made everything and is everything. That's it. We can go home. Sometimes I ask my students, what would that look like if you made environmental law based on that? What kind of society would we create if that was one of our orchestrating principles? Here I've been guided by the work of Deborah Bird Rose, who was a phenomenal and much lamented, she died a few years ago, anthropologist who introduced me in her writing to a term called biryun, which is an Aboriginal word from the Australian Indigenous peoples, which translates to shimmer. But here, and I quote, she says, this is the shimmer, the brilliance that allows you, that grabs you and brings you into the experience of being part of a vibrant and vibrating world. It is one's actual capacity to see and experience ancestral power. I encountered what Deborah Bird Rose was arguing there. And all of a sudden, here we're coming back to the theme of rewilding, something that I had seen, I don't know, a dozen times before, now made sense to me in a totally different way. Here you have a passage from the Zohar, the 13th century, one of the crown jewels of the Jewish mystical tradition, where there are a bunch of rabbis and they're sitting around. And in the Zoharic tradition, one thing that you don't do is study inside. You're always outside. They're encountering trees, they're encountering rocks, they're encountering rivers, they're encountering landscapes, they're encountering donkeys and donkey drivers who transform their consciousness. But let's return to the trees for just a minute. Here you have them sitting, and they sit underneath a tree, and they say, let's give back to this tree. Other places they describe that as, they say, here in this tree we have what in Aramaic is called tsechota deoraita, brilliance of Torah, shimmering. It's there in the tree, it's not just in the text. So what do you do when you've received a gift? You give it back. As Robin Wall Kimmerer says in Braiding Sweetgrass, with gifts from the landscape comes not a bundle of rights, but a bundle of responsibilities. And so what is the great gift that you can give to a place? Torah, learning, not in the sense of bookishness. I think this is Torah in the biggest sense of a kind of life path. I'm mindful of time, but I want to just put onto the um, table, as it were, that with this comes a sense of attentiveness to our place and where the food that we have comes from. In the rabbinic tradition, there's an ancient teaching that when the temple stood, the altar was a site of atonement for the Jewish people. And then the Talmud says, in our modern day, meaning in the 6th century, it's the table that we eat at that provides atonement. And the question is like, what the heck? Why? What's the connection in between them? And all the commentators are very clear. It's how you share with other people. That's what provides atonement. Or in other words, restoring the connection between the human being and God. How do we do that? We restore our connections with other people. And that's actually the source of an ancient, or at least medieval custom among certain Ashkenazi Jews, that when a member of a household died, they would build the coffin out of their dining room table. Why? Because that's the place where we've done these acts of connection, where we've created, um, where we've expanded our capacity for help, and where we have provided others with sustenance that they might so need. Now, I'm going to speak for maybe 8 more minutes, maybe a few less, because I want to make sure to leave plenty of time for a robust discussion. But I do want to make two other points. One is that human and non-human species are seen in Jewish mystical sources, and I'm sure you can see how this would be a natural extension of the vision of the world as shimmering, as totally entangled one with the other. And that means that non-human species, be they plants, be they animals, are here not to serve some human need, but because their value and their being is autonomous. It's beyond the realm of human instrumentalization. Why are they worthy? Because they are. There's a thread of Jewish thinking that goes even farther and says, not only are they autonomous in the sense of having their own innate worth that can't be measured with dollar signs, they are revealers of Torah. There is a vision of Torah that can only come to us from the animals that surround us. We learn from the animals, and they become our teachers. One of the ancient sources that picks up these books of the verses from the book of Job, which I've put in front of you here, I find heartbreaking and moving in equal measures. Adam and Eve are mourning the death of their son, Abel, and they don't know what to do with the body. They've never experienced death before. So, says the Midrash, along comes a family of crows. One of the crows dies, and they see one crow buried by all of its brethren. And then they all set to cawing. And then Adam and Eve learn, this is what we do with our dead. This is how we pay the ultimate respects. Turns out, I just read a dissertation from the last few years that Corvidae, the family that involve crows, that crows are a part of, actually do have some kind of possible burial practices. So biology has really borne this out, although it took us 1,500 years to confirm it. Whether or not that is true or not, I think the Midrash is trying to point our eyes to the fact that if we see the world as just grist for the mill of human ingenuity, then not only do we miss out on human potential, we have undercut the source of revelation. And that means that when a species goes extinct, part of the divine voice ends. And that when a species is done, part of revelation ceases. Now, with that, I hope, comes a very significant sense of responsibility. And here I want to put into your hands a text from the 19th century, which reimagines in a tremendously bold way the verse, "Let us make the human being in our image," not as God speaking to the angels or God speaking in the royal we, but as God speaking to all of the animals. The text then says, each and every animal was created, every species, each and every species of life. Do you wish to be created? And evidently the answer was yes, although sometimes I wonder which species said no and are still up in some kind of celestial realm of potential. But the ones who said yes, we've experienced here. Then the text says, but no creature is asked regarding the others. So each one is asked on its own. Why? Because, says the text, the more creaturely life and the more vegetative life there is, the greater thickness in biological terms of that biodiversity, the better it is for all of them. But, says the author of this source, when it comes to human beings, when it came to creating the first humans, God asks all of the other creatures if human beings should be created. They evidently agreed, and here we are. Now, it is certainly true. This is a text written by people. Of course, the animals are going to say yes. It's also a text that knows we're here, right? I get it. On the other hand, imagine, if you will, what this might mean for a kind of ethic of responsibility. The text says humans have a capacity for destruction that outstrips others. If that's the case, what does it mean, I ask, that our being, our existence, is entirely indebted to the permission of non-human forms of life? Rather than seeing human beings at the top of that celestial hierarchy, this text provides a very different way for thinking about the way that human existence has what the great philosopher Emmanuel Levinas would call a pre-ontological, before we come into being, debt, a pre-ontological obligation. So imagine then, what would we decide to do in terms of the way that we treat non-human species of any kind? How might this change our art? How might this change our laws? How might this change our society? Okay. One more big point, um, having to do with climate law. I don't know if there are any lawyers in the room. We are woefully unprepared in American law for climate change. And that has to do with a total lack or a near total lack of any kind of values or ideals that have been set into law, other than the legislation that was pushed through in the 1970s. Um, and that means that almost all environmental law has to be done in the domestically on the grounds of procedure rather than substance, which means that we're arguing about infractions of the law rather than some kind of bigger ethical complaint. And this means that we need to do what the environmental lawyer Douglas Kaiser, who teaches at Yale, has called stretching the moral imagination of the law. We need a new reservoir for thinking. And I'm happy to say more about this in the Q&A, but Jewish legal sources have given us a way of thinking about obligations rather than rights as the foundation stone of a legal regime. Obligations to the world, obligations to animals and plants, and obligations to one another. They've given us a language for responding to foreseeability, to multiple causation, to cumulative damage, to what some have called slow violence. to responsibility for externalized harms, to obligations toward future generations within the law, to how we govern the commons, to even how we might think about climate reparations on a global scale. So with that, I'm going to bring my arguments and my exploration back to where we started, which is the question of renewal. I'm guided in my thinking along with Pope Francis, the great works of Abraham Joshua Heschel, who in a text that was largely unpublished, or was unpublished until later, argued that acts of dissent are also acts of renewal. That one of the things that religious voices, Jewish voices, Catholic voices, Islamic voices, Buddhist voices, Hindu voices, indigenous voices can bring to the table is as follows: deep caring, concern, untrammeled radical thinking informed by rich learning, a degree of audacity and courage, and the power of the word. Religious traditions do far more than prop up contemporary environmental thinking, although they can be helpful for that. They unseat so many of our assumptions about the way that human beings tell our own story, and they provide us with a totally different vocabulary and set of values that can lead us into a much better world. If we've been talking about the tree on Rosh Hashanah, La'ilan, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring the text that describes the entire cosmos as a single tree. The leaves are us, we are the leaves of that tree, and it means that no place is not connected with another place, no person is not connected with other people, no tradition is not connected with others, and yet each one has its own specificity, its own radiant beauty and uniqueness. And I'd like to close by recalling that in the story, the book of Genesis, we're told that there is a mighty and beautiful tree in the midst of the garden. That's the tree of life. And then we're told that there's also a tree of knowledge of good and evil. Franz Kafka picked up what the Zohar intimated already in the 13th century. You could read that as two different trees. But what if it's actually just one tree? And it depends on how you look at it. And if we have the courage and the creativity and the collaborative spirit, we can sit and learn not with a tree of good and evil, but with that vibrating tree, with that vibrant tree that is the tree of life. So with that, I'll say thank you for your attentiveness. I know that's a lot of information and a lot of thoughts, and I look forward to the ensuing conversation.
Thank you so much. That was, I think, very transformative and, as you said, a lot of information, but really inspiring and a call to action. We have a little bit of time for questions. As I said at the beginning, and we've also put into the chat, you can either put your questions into the chat or you can raise your hands and I will call on you. Please wait to be called on to speak. Feel free also to be on camera if you want to speak. We also have some people in the room here at CTU, so if any of you want to ask a question, please just raise your hands and I'll try to be attentive to who is in the room. So with that, I invite anyone to raise their hands either physically or virtually. I have a question as people maybe come and think about what they might be thinking about. Admittedly, I'm pulling from my knowledge of the Jewish tradition, and maybe this is a annoying question, but I've always been troubled by a Mishnah in Avot 3:7, right, where describes the rabbis as saying, if you're in the middle of your learning and you stop to comment on a beautiful tree or a beautiful field, it's as though you are mortally guilty. And I've admittedly been troubled by it because I study ideas of vision and beauty in Jewish tradition and find that to be a very challenging text, but it also seems very challenging with what you presented to us about the nature of trees in this tradition. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how that Mishnah fits into your account. Is it just a different tradition, and we have many, and they don't all agree in Judaism, or is there a way of kind of making sense of it in your theology of trees that you offered us?
Thanks. I really appreciate that question. I guess following my own logic about how religions have so many different voices within them and not all of them need to get lifted up, one part of the answer would be, for sure, within the rabbinic tradition going all the way up until the 20th and 21st century, there is a vein of thinking within Jewish sources that either ignores or actively derides the natural world. You find that all across the board in philosophers, Kabbalists. I don't think that there's an easy way to distinguish where and how that appears. But I'm going to go in a different direction, which is that one of the things that I've learned from the founder of Hasidism, the Baal Shem Tov, who I've had the pleasure of studying his writings and teachings now for almost 30 years, which is crazy. One of the things that I've learned from him is the way that sources like that can be read not exactly against the grain, but in a way that's a little bit surprising. So, for example, he says on the rabbinic adage in Bava Batra, in one of the tractates of the Talmud, that says you're not supposed to give away more than 1/5 of your money to charity. You're not supposed to waste it. Al yifazbez. You shouldn't waste more than that. So he says, if you see it as a waste, don't give more. But if you don't see it as a waste, give as much as you can. So the way that he read this Mishnah was, if you see looking at a tree as a break in your learning, you've entered into a place of mortal hazard. But if you see it as an extension of your learning, and see it as contiguous and continuous, and you realize that the white fire on the page of the Talmud and the white fire that is present in Revelation also extends to every element of the natural world, then what you've done is see that Torah is so much bigger than a book that lives in the ark of a synagogue, and is that kind of pulsing energy that can be found in the trees, it can be found in the animals, it can be found in other people, and it can actually be found in the ground itself.
It's beautiful, and I think also for me it's helpful. If everything in certain ways is the tree, right? The Torah is part of it.
Yeah, exactly.
With that, I invite again any other questions. I see Richard. You want to unmute?
So I joined late, so if you actually spent time talking about this and don't want to talk about it again, that's okay. But I've always been intrigued by the verse, I guess from Tehillim, Az Yarananu Atzei Ya'ar. The trees are singing.
Mm-hmm.
And curious how you envision that. Do they have consciousness, that they are literally themselves deciding to sing to Hashem? Is there something else that we are supposed to derive from that verse? And again, if you already answered that question previously, I apologize.
Thanks, Richard. I didn't, and I love that verse. And you might say the entire ethos that it represents within the Book of Psalms, which you find in an ancient source that really gets picked up by the medievals of the world is being filled with songs. And the world is filled with songs that the plants and the animals are all singing to God. I'm hesitant in a biological sense to attribute consciousness to trees, although there's interesting philosophical work being done within the environmental humanities on tree thinking and tree consciousness, which admittedly is so different from human consciousness that we have no idea what it looks like. But the idea that trees are static in any sense, literal or philosophical, has been, I think, roundly disproven in the way that the, incapacity of animals to use tools has been disproven since the work of Jane Goodall. And without overstating the case, it's clear that there are communicative properties, not in the mathematical sense, but there are communicative capacities that trees have. But the reason that I love those sources so much is that they remind us that the world not only is filled with mystery, but the world is filled with these songs. And there are indigenous traditions that name trees based on the sound of wind through their leaves. You find this also in Japanese poetry, interestingly enough. And we have this capacity that is sometimes described in Jewish sources of great sages who can listen to the trees and hear God's voice. And I don't think that's simply a kind of clairvoyance in the impoverished sense, but it's tapping into a world that is animate in ways that we don't understand. And I think the book of Psalms, precisely because it comes at a point in the crystallization of the Hebrew Bible in which those ancient mythic dimensions of the gods of the sea are only one step hidden in the book of Psalms. And okay, God is in charge, but this world that is filled with this kind of power is something that you find there. One of my teachers once said, you have to learn Hebrew, if for nothing else, just to read Psalm 104 and its description of the creation of the world. And here, rather than a world of static beings, that psalm invites us to consider what it might be like to listen to a world that is filled with the orchestra of divine songs.
I see a hand
Thank
from
you.
Mazar, if you would like to unmute.
Yes, I have a question about the mystic from Tzvat you mentioned,
Sure.
how he sees presence of God in this creation, in this case in the stone. How is it different from the view of Spinoza for his, naturalistic, godlike, pantheistic views and he got in trouble for that, and Tzvat people, did not.
Amazing question. So thank you. When Spinoza utters his or writes his famous words, God, comma, or nature, and that's generally interpreted as a kind of pantheism of God being equated with nature, that's one of the things that gets him kicked out of the Jewish community. That was a community that had an allergy, like in a literal sense, to anything that smacked of difference or of heresy, and that had to do with its own history of recent years. And what's interesting about the history of Jewish thought is that what got you in trouble in Western Europe was totally uninterestingly bland in Eastern Europe. You will find at exactly the same time that Moses Mendelssohn and many of the others of the Jewish and also greater German Enlightenment are arguing over what's the Pantheismusstreit, the disagreement over who's a pantheist. It was like the worst thing you could be called was a pantheist. You find these Eastern European rabbis who are saying, yeah, God's everywhere. God is everything. What's the problem here? There are no lines of communication, but what you find there in Eastern Europe is a kind of full-throated and unafraid declaration of something that in Western European eyes would have been suspect. In part, some people have argued that that's because the gaze of Christianity in Western Europe meant that Jews were very, very nervous in ways that they weren't in Eastern Europe. I'm a little skeptical of that. And rather, I think what happens is that in Western Europe, very specific definitions of communal belonging and also what is allowed within the canon of thought cohere. And I think that's not just defensive, but you don't have that in Eastern Europe. And what you have there is a kind of explosive power in the 18th and 19th centuries of theological ingenuity. Now, many people have noted that Hasidism has much in common with Spinoza, and that indeed more recent scholarship has demonstrated that what people once thought was the pantheism or panentheism of Hasidism actually goes back to the 16th century in Sfat, and it really is core to their way of thinking. The distinction that's often drawn is that, well, at least most interpretations of Spinoza point toward God being nature. What you find in these other sources is that God is nature, comma, and also everything else. And so it is this vision of nature as being but one instantiation of the divine within a cosmos that is suffused with divinity on so many different levels within multiple cosmoses. That's the distinction. So it's called panentheism. That's what sometimes people call it, which means that God is everything but not limited by it. There's so much more divinity left out and in the world of potential, whereas it's generally understood by the interpreters of Spinoza that he means God is nature, nature is God, but that's it.
Any last questions? We're nearing sort of 9:15, so close to our end point. So if there's one more question, I know it's quite. All right, we have a question in the room, so speak loudly.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, great.
I'm really curious about like the audience for your project. And I was just curious whether you see yourself as trying to persuade someone that like who does not believe in this kind of other tradition that you've like so eloquently kind of described and laid out. And I guess part of the reason I'm asking this is that in my day job, my other life, I'm a jail chaplain. And I meet a lot of people who are really convinced about the Messiah and redemption and are really convinced about the third temple in the other world and are not that interested in this world. And as a chaplain, it's not my job to persuade them or tell them that you're wrong. There are things you can do right here and now that matter. And so I'm hoping that your answer is no, you're not being trying to persuade something else. But I'm curious how you who you see your audience is, especially as someone who works within the academy, and also how you would even engage people who don't even share the same basic premise as you.
Yeah. So I'll start with a specific example, which is that whether it's for incarcerated people or people who are impoverished, to argue against a belief in a better hereafter or a better world that is yet coming would be a place of my, I would say, unconscionable use of my own privilege. So I would absolutely not enter into that. What I learn in the context when I work with people for whom life circumstances are extremely difficult has a lot less to do with next worldly visions and a lot more to do with capacities for connection and visions of care in this world, whether that's theologies of bedside chaplaincy or ways that we can continue to remain connected with others, even within difficult circumstances, like in the writings of the religious traditions from within the Warsaw Ghetto. But I think one of the great gifts of Jewish teaching, and you find this in certain elements of Christianity also, is an embrace of this worldly connection as being a decisive element of religious life, and to share in the brokenheartedness of another is sometimes all the gift that we can give. It's another way of thinking about staying with the trouble. But in terms of the broader audience, I guess there are a couple. One has to do with, one is religious people of different stripes. Another is the environmental humanists and those who are engaged in the environmental humanities within the academy. Another is most of my teaching now is actually not in religious studies, but in the School of Sustainability, where I teach future climate engineers and sometimes policymakers and water science specialists why they should care about the more than human world in a way that it goes beyond the material. And I have found over the past 10 years a significant increase in the interest in that kind of work, which has been very interesting and somewhat gratifying to see. And the last audience, which is the audience that is perhaps the largest, are people who are concerned with our world, or concerned by our world, and are interested in finding new vocabularies for what it means to be a human being in the world that allows for a kind of a different vision of flourishing that is both more equitable and also more courageous.
I see one more raised hand, but this is going to be our last question because we've let our speaker get on with this evening. So Ronald, if you want to unmute and ask your question.
Yes, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. And it's really touched my heart. At the same time, it provokes a number of questions. One of the things that you mentioned is the unpreparedness of the United States legally to take this project regarding the climate change.
Mm-hmm.
My first question would be, how is the world, like from your statistic, maybe from your observation, how is the world at large prepared for this? Then another thing, maybe the other side of the same question is, how would the unpreparedness of the US at this particular point, with the influence they have, affect the efforts to act now regarding, let me call it, building a better tomorrow from today, at the moment when we can act and save. Thank you.
I really appreciate the question, so thank you so much. The world at large, just like climate change, there's no such thing as climate change. It's actually a bundle of concerns that are all wrapped up together. No continent can be spoken of in broad terms. On the other hand, the European Union has a very clear set of principles. They have 4 principles that they use when thinking about climate legislation. And while they're not moving fast enough, at least they have, I think, a better sense of where they wish to go. I think it's actually in developing countries where, on the one hand, you find sometimes significant climate emissions. On the other hand, there is a much more, I would say, capacious willingness to investigate other solutions. And if the World Fund and the IMF can get out of the way, I think locally oriented solutions, which in fact is exactly what Pope Francis describes in Laudato Si, are beginning to emerge in ways that are very exciting and very, very captivating. In terms of the United States, I'll tell you personally, I have very little hope in the federal government, but I had very little hope in the federal government in 2022. That's not a new story. What I've been really gratified to see has been a wave of local legislation that has been pushed forward really over the past 15 years, regardless of who's in the White House, which affirms the right of local citizens to everything from a right to a clean environment to actual, like, literal rights of nature legislation that are being pushed forward in Western Pennsylvania, for example, in the middle of coal country. And I think rather than looking for grand solutions from the top down, the humility of working slowly, but also working together, will happen on the local plane.
Okay, well, with that, I think sort of call to action for all of us. I want to thank our speaker again. People in the Zoom want to, put in their clapping hands. We can give a round of applause. Thank you so much. A belated Tu B'Shvat Sameach. Happy Tu B'Shvat for everybody, and have a good night. And thank you so much for joining us. This is
Thank you all for having me. My email address is easy to find. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'd love to be in conversation with you and continue to think about these questions.
Thank you.
All right. Take good care, and thank you so much.